The call came on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that carries no particular weight until it suddenly carries everything. Her aunt had died 3 days earlier, quietly, without warning, in the small house on the edge of town where she had lived for as long as anyone in the family could remember. There had been no dramatic farewell, no drawn-out illness, no gathering of relatives around a bedside. She had simply stopped, the way a clock sometimes stops, not from any single cause, but from an accumulation of years that finally reached their limit. The niece, whose name was Clara, had been the one they called. Not because she was the closest in blood, but because she was the one who always answered. Clara was 38 years old enough to have learned that grief did not always arrive dressed the way you expected it to. And sometimes it came quietly, wearing the clothes of practical obligation, asking you to sort through drawers and arrange for services and sign papers before the feeling itself had time to settle. She had taken a week off work, driven the 4 hours to the house, and let herself in with the spare key her aunt had pressed into her hand years ago with the simple instruction to hold on to it. She had not thought much about that gesture at the time. Now, standing in the entrance of the small, still house, it felt weighted with something she could not quite name. The family had already decided, by a kind of quiet consensus reached over the phone in the days following the death, that the house and its contents needed to be cleared efficiently. Her aunt had not been a wealthy woman, not by any obvious measure. The house was modest, its furnishings old but carefully tended. There was no grand inheritance to distribute, no estate lawyer in a suit waiting with documents. There was only a life's worth of accumulated objects and the task of determining what to do with each of them. Clara's 2 cousins had volunteered to handle the larger pieces of furniture and the practical items. A donation truck had been scheduled for Saturday morning, 4 days away. She began in the kitchen, working methodically through cabinets and drawers, separating items into the categories she had mentally assigned: keep, donate, discard. It was easier here, where objects were defined by function and held less personal weight. A set of mixing bowls her aunt had used for decades, a coffee maker still in reasonable condition, shelf after shelf of carefully labeled jars, and their contents reduced to dry residue. She worked without thinking too deeply, letting her hands guide her, and for a while the task felt manageable. Subscribe and comment below where you are watching from and what you would have done in her place. The living room changed the pace. Here, the objects resisted easy categorization. A framed photograph on the side table showed her aunt as a young woman, laughing at something beyond the frame's edge, her face caught in an expression Clara had never seen in person. A small bookcase held titles that revealed a reading life she had never known about: philosophy, foreign language instruction guides, dense historical texts with cracked spines that suggested they had been read more than once. She slowed down in this room, picking things up and turning them over, only surprised again and again by evidence of a person she had known only partially. The secretary desk stood against the far wall, between 2 windows, positioned to catch the morning light. She had seen it on every visit to this house for as long as she could remember, had walked past it hundreds of times, without giving it more than a passing glance. It was old, not dramatically so, but genuinely aged, its surface a deep reddish-brown wood that had been polished so often its grain had taken on an almost reflective quality. The design was classic and deliberate, a slanted writing surface that folded down to reveal a small workspace, flanked by narrow drawers and cubbyholes, and supported by 4 legs that tapered at the base. Her cousin Marcus arrived mid-morning, carrying coffee and a practical energy that Clara found both helpful and slightly at odds with the mood of the house. He moved through the rooms quickly, assessing volume and weight, making rapid decisions about what would fit in the donation truck and what would need to be hauled separately. When he reached the living room, he stopped at the secretary desk and ran his hand along its surface with the expression of someone calculating logistics rather than considering sentiment. It was old, he said, but not the kind of antique that anyone would pay real money for. Heavy, awkward dimensions. The donation center would probably take it. Clara said nothing immediately. She was looking at the desk with a different kind of attention and trying to understand what it was about the piece that made her resistant to the casual efficiency of that verdict. She had no particular emotional attachment to it. She could not remember her aunt ever sitting at it in her presence or speaking about it in any specific way. Yet something about the deliberate care with which it had been placed, the way its surface had been polished, not merely maintained, but actively tended, as though it mattered, made her pause. She told Marcus she wanted to keep it. He looked at her with mild surprise and then shrugged, making a note on his clipboard that it would be set aside. He moved on. She stood with the desk for a moment longer, then continued her own work through the rest of the house. The afternoon brought more decisions, more discoveries, and a more quiet evidence of a life that had been richer and stranger than its exterior suggested. A box of letters in a language Clara did not recognize, a small locked tin that rattled with something light and metallic, a set of keys whose locks no longer existed anywhere in the house. She cataloged these things rather than discarding them, a habit born of uncertainty. Packing them into a box, she labeled simply, "Things to understand later." That evening, after Marcus had gone, and the donation truck's inventory had been tallied and left on the kitchen counter, Clara sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea gone cold. The house was different at night, its silence specific rather than general, shaped by the particular absence of its former inhabitant. She found herself looking at the secretary desk from across the room, not caught by the same vague sense of unfinished attention she had felt earlier. She set down the cup, crossed the room, and folded down the writing surface for the first time. The interior was more complex than she had anticipated. A row of narrow cubbyholes ran along the back, each just wide enough to hold a small sheaf of papers. 2 shallow drawers sat below the cubbyholes, fitted with small brass pulls, worn smooth from handling. She pulled open the first drawer and found nothing but a few old pen nibs and a dried inkwell. The second contained a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a receipt from a hardware store, dated 22 years earlier. She closed both drawers and stood looking at the interior, aware that her hands were moving now with a different quality of curiosity than her earlier methodical sorting had required. The cubbyholes were empty except for dust, and one yellowed envelope containing what appeared to be a single page of handwritten figures, arranged in columns with no labels she could interpret. She set this aside and turned her attention to the structure of the desk itself. She pressed her fingers along the interior walls, testing for the slight give or variation in resistance that might indicate a hidden space, an old habit acquired from years of reading about such things without ever expecting to encounter them. The left wall was solid. The right wall yielded something unexpected at its far edge, a subtle click, nearly inaudible, that corresponded to a slight shift in the wood surface. She pressed again, more deliberately, and the right interior panel swung inward on a pivot hinge she had not been able to see. Behind it was a compartment, narrow and deep, running the full height of the desk's interior. The space inside was dark, and she reached for her phone and used its light to see. What she found was not a single dramatic object, but a layered collection of items arranged with the same care she had noticed in the desk's visible surfaces. Several envelopes, bound together with a piece of string that had dried and stiffened with age. A small leather notebook, its cover cracked but intact. And beneath these, wrapped in a cloth that had once been green and had faded to something closer to gray, a flat metal case roughly the size of a hardcover book. She removed everything carefully, placing each piece on the writing surface as though it were fragile, though nothing about the items suggested fragility. The envelopes came first. She untied the string and opened the topmost envelope with the same sense of deliberate attention one brings to something that may not offer a second chance. Inside were several folded documents, their edges soft with age, their printing dense and formal in the way of legal instruments. She spread them flat and began to read, slowly, aware that her comprehension was falling behind the pace at which meaning was assembling itself around her. The documents were financial in nature. That much was clear immediately. They referenced accounts and institutions, some of which she recognized, and some of which she did not. Figures appeared in the text, precise and substantial, accompanied by dates that stretched back more than 4 decades. She read without interpretation at first, simply absorbing language, so letting her mind hold the pieces without yet attempting to arrange them. By the 3rd page, she had stopped moving entirely. Her breathing had slowed. The room around her had receded to the periphery of her awareness, replaced by the concentrated fact of what she was holding. The documents described a trust, established quietly and with evident legal precision, its beneficiaries defined not by name, but by relationship, in language that would have required a lawyer to interpret with confidence, but that she could follow well enough to understand its broad intent. Assets had been placed into the trust over a period of years, consistently and in substantial amounts, contributed through a network of instruments that she recognized now as deliberate rather than incidental. The total figure, so referenced in multiple documents and confirmed in a summary letter bearing the letterhead of a firm she had never heard of, was expressed first in an older currency equivalent, then converted, then updated in what appeared to be a later annotation added in a different hand. The number, after she had read it 3 times, remained the same. $295 million. She sat down on the floor, not from any dramatic compulsion, but simply because standing no longer seemed like the most reasonable physical posture for what was happening. The house was silent around her. The desk stood above her, its hidden compartment still open, the remaining items still waiting on the writing surface. She stayed on the floor for several minutes, her back against the leg of a nearby chair, the document still in her hands, reading the number again without expecting it to change. When she stood and returned to the desk, she opened the leather notebook. The handwriting inside was her aunt's. She recognized it immediately from birthday cards and holiday letters, and the small notes her aunt had occasionally sent without occasion, just to say she had been thinking of someone. The same neat, deliberate script filled the notebook's pages in entries that were not dated in the conventional sense, but were numbered, as though their sequence mattered more than their calendar position. The early entries were spare and technical, referencing transactions and decisions in language that confirmed her aunt had understood precisely what she was doing and why. Later, entries grew more reflective, though never sentimental. She read for a long time. The notebook described a life that had operated in parallel to the one Clara had known, not secretly in any shameful sense, but privately, with the self-containment of a person who had learned, for reasons the notebook only partially explained, not to attach her financial reality to her visible life. Her aunt had worked for decades in a field Clara had only vaguely understood, financial advisory work for clients whose names were referenced only by initials. Over time, through compensation, through investment, through a series of decisions made with a quiet and disciplined intelligence, she had accumulated what the documents described. The notebook made clear that this had not been hidden from everyone. A lawyer was referenced, identified only by last name, who had been the architect of the trust's legal structure. A single trusted friend appeared several times, always in the context of verification rather than consultation, as though her aunt had wanted a witness rather than an advisor. The trust itself had been designed with careful intention, its conditions structured to transfer assets to the family line upon her aunt's death, to be identified and claimed through the very process of settling the estate. The desk was not an accident of placement. It was the delivery mechanism. Clara opened the metal case last. Inside, nestled in a cut foam interior that fit them precisely, were 2 items. The first was a sealed envelope marked with a single word in her aunt's handwriting, her own name. The second was a card with a phone number and the name of the law firm. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was brief and written in the same direct, unornamented style as the notebook entries. Her aunt explained, without apology or excessive sentiment, that she had chosen Clara specifically, not arbitrarily. She had watched her niece over the years with more attention than Clara had realized. She had seen someone who answered when called, who stayed when others left, who valued things not for their apparent worth, but for what they represented about the people who had held them. She had left the desk to be kept by exactly that quality of attention. The letter asked only one thing, that the trust be administered with the same care that had created it, that the people it was intended to benefit receive what had been set aside for them, that the lawyer be contacted within 30 days of the desk's discovery, and that Clara understand, without needing further explanation, that the reason the secretary desk had been polished so carefully for so many decades was not because her aunt valued the furniture. It was because she valued what was inside it. Clara sat with the letter for a long time. Outside, the night had moved into the hours where silence becomes absolute, stripped of all ambient noise and left with only its own weight. She thought about the phone calls she had not made over the years, the visits she had abbreviated, the occasions when obligation had brought her here rather than genuine choice. She thought about the moments when genuine choice had brought her anyway, and about how little she had known on any of those visits about the person sitting across from her at the kitchen table. She thought about the desk against the wall, present on every one of those visits, on holding its compartment closed with a patience that matched the patience of the woman who had placed it there. In the morning, she called Marcus and told him the desk would not be going to the donation center. She did not explain further, and he did not press her. She spent the next several hours photographing every document and entering the firm's number into her phone 3 times before finally dialing it. The call was answered by a receptionist who transferred her to a lawyer who had been waiting, he said, for a call from this number for some time. His tone was professional and prepared in a way that confirmed the situation had been anticipated precisely. He asked her to describe what she had found, and she did, and he confirmed each detail with the practiced brevity of someone who had reviewed the relevant file many times. The process that followed was not simple. It extended over months, through layers of verification and documentation, through a probate process that the lawyer navigated with evident familiarity and occasional commentary that suggested he had expected certain complications and had prepared accordingly. There were moments of bureaucratic friction, of institutions that required multiple contacts before they would acknowledge what the documents claimed. There were family conversations that required delicacy, relatives who had not expected any of this and responded to the news with reactions that ranged from disbelief to complex emotion to a silence that was harder to read than either. Clara found herself returning often to the notebook, not for the financial details, which were being handled through proper channels, but for the entries that described her aunt's thinking about the decisions she had made. There was a passage near the middle of the notebook that she read many times, in which her aunt wrote about the difference between hiding something and protecting it. She wrote that hiding suggested shame or fear, while protection suggested intention and care. She had not been hiding her life. She had been protecting what it had built, holding it in trust for people who would know what to do with it, or at least who would try. The trust, when it was finally administered, distributed funds to a set of beneficiaries that her aunt had identified over years of quiet observation. Family members whose circumstances she had watched and assessed with the same analytical attention she had applied to her professional work. Causes she had supported anonymously for decades, now receiving what had been intended for them from the beginning. Institutions whose work she had believed in without any expectation that anyone would know she had believed in them. Clara's own portion was not the largest, and she had not expected it to be. What she received instead, beyond the financial allocation, was something the notebook described in its final entry, written in a hand slightly less steady than the earlier ones, as though it had been composed when the years were becoming visible in the writing itself. She received the desk, not as a bequest listed in a will, but as the original thing, still standing in the living room where it had always stood, still holding the quality of attention that had recognized it for what it was. And her aunt wrote that she hoped Clara would keep it somewhere the morning light could reach it. She had always found that the light made the wood look like it was thinking. There were things that could not be fully resolved, questions the documents raised but did not answer, aspects of her aunt's history that remained opaque even after months of reading and inquiry. The lawyer was helpful within the bounds of what his role required, but there were decisions his client had made before their professional relationship began that he could only describe in outline. The notebook's early entries referenced a period in her aunt's life that predated anything Clara had known, marked by a circumstance the writing described only obliquely as a narrowing, a point at which the visible path had closed and a different kind of attention had become necessary. She understood, without needing the complete picture, that her aunt had built the life she built because certain other lives had not been available to her. She had not spoken about this because she had not believed speaking about it would serve any purpose beyond the speaking. She had believed instead in doing, in the patient accumulation of intention over time, in the desk against the wall with the light falling across it, waiting for someone who would notice that it had been polished with more care than furniture alone requires. On the last day she spent in the house before the estate was formally concluded, Clara stood in the now empty living room with the desk still against the wall, waiting to be transported to her own home. The space where her aunt's other belongings had stood was marked by lighter patches on the floor and faint outlines on the walls, the kind of traces that reveal themselves only when everything else has been removed. She looked at these outlines for a while, then looked at the desk and thought about the morning light her aunt had written about and the quality of attention her aunt had believed she possessed. She was not certain the belief was fully warranted. She knew herself well enough to know that she was inconsistent, that her attention was sometimes genuine and sometimes merely habitual, that she had walked past this desk for decades without once pressing her fingers along its interior wall. But she also knew that on the morning she had stood in the living room and refused, without being able to fully articulate why, so to let it be loaded onto a donation truck, something real had been operating. Not wisdom, necessarily. Not even instinct in any mystical sense. Simply a resistance to letting things go before they had been properly seen. Her aunt had understood that resistance. She had counted on it. She had polished the desk for 30 years and waited for someone to notice that wood does not shine like that without reason. She had placed the morning light where it could do its work and arranged the rest with the quiet confidence of someone who had long since made her peace with the pace at which certain truths travel. Clara loaded the desk carefully into the back of the rented van, wrapping its legs in moving blankets and securing the writing surface so it would not swing open on the highway. She drove home through 4 hours of changing landscape, the desk steady in the back, the light shifting across the afternoon, the the number her aunt had built over decades riding along with her, belonging now to the people it had always been intended to reach. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. More hidden discoveries, forgotten fortunes, and true-style stories are waiting. Watch the next video on the channel and share this one with someone who believes that the most important things are often the ones hiding in plain sight. The desk arrived at Clara's home on a Thursday afternoon, and she placed it in the room she used as a study, against the east-facing wall where the morning light would find it first. She had not told anyone at work about what she had discovered in the compartment. She had not told most of her family either, deep beyond what the lawyer had communicated through official channels in the careful language of estate administration. There was a period of weeks, extending into the first months after the house was closed and the estate formally opened, during which she lived with the knowledge the way you live with something large and unfamiliar in a small space, always aware of it, always adjusting your movements to account for its presence. The lawyer's name was Aldrin, and he had handled her aunt's affairs for 19 years. He was a deliberate man in his early 60s, who spoke in complete sentences and never used more words than the situation required, a quality Clara found increasingly valuable as the estate process extended and the number of people with questions multiplied. He had been present at the first formal meeting with the family in a way that suggested he had attended many such meetings and had developed a working method for managing the range of emotions they produced. He was not cold, he was simply precise. Her aunt, he told her during their second conversation, had admired precision above most other qualities. It was Aldrin who first indicated that the process would encounter resistance. He used that word specifically, resistance, and the care with which he chose it told her that he was describing something he had anticipated rather than something that had surprised him. The trust had been legally structured with considerable sophistication, he explained, by which he meant that it had been designed to withstand exactly the kind of scrutiny that was now being applied to it. The question was not whether the documents were valid. They were. The question was whether certain parties would accept that validity without requiring it to be demonstrated through extended legal procedure. The party in question was her cousin, Diane, who was not among the trust's named beneficiaries. This was not an oversight. Aldrin made that clear in the same precise way he made most things clear, without editorializing, simply presenting the fact and allowing it to carry its own weight. Her aunt had known Diane well and had considered her position carefully over the years that the trust had been in formation. The notebook contained references to this consideration, though Clara had not fully understood them until now. Her aunt had written in one of the entries Clara had read and reread that love and trust were not the same thing, and that the obligation to care about a person did not require you to place in their hands what you had built through careful decades. Diane's reaction to the existence of the trust had been immediate and definite. She had called Clara the evening after Aldrin's formal notification reached the family, and the call had lasted 40 minutes, during which Clara said relatively little, and listened with the careful attention she had apparently inherited as a temperamental quality from a woman she had not fully known. Diane spoke about fairness and about expectation, and about the years she had spent maintaining a relationship with their aunt that she described as close, by which she meant frequent, by which she meant that she had called every Sunday and visited at Christmas, and believed, on the basis of this consistency, that she had earned a place in whatever the estate contained. The fact that the estate contained what it contained made this belief not smaller, but larger, a grievance inflated by the scale of what she had not received. Clara understood the feeling, even if she did not share the conclusion. She had spent enough time with the notebook to know that her aunt had not been indifferent to Diane, but had made a considered judgment, the kind of judgment that could only be made by someone who had spent decades watching people closely and had arrived at a distinction that comfort and reliability were not the same as the quality she had been looking for. What that quality was, her aunt had never named directly in the notebook. She had described it in circling language, referring to a willingness to stay with something past the point of its obvious reward, to a way of attending to objects and people that did not require them to announce their value in order to receive care. Diane retained a lawyer of her own within 2 weeks of the notification. The action was presented to the family as a reasonable step, a matter of seeking clarification rather than expressing hostility. Clara accepted this framing without arguing against it, partly because arguing would not have changed anything, and partly because she understood that what Diane was experiencing was real, even if its legal expression was unlikely to succeed. Aldrin had reviewed the challenge with the same equanimity he brought to everything, and had told Clara that they would respond through proper channels, and that the structure of the trust was designed precisely for this kind of scrutiny. His confidence wasn't performance. It was grounded in 19 years of preparation. What the challenge produced, beyond legal procedure, was a deepening of Clara's investigation into the notebook. She had been reading it carefully since the night she found it, but the legal proceedings gave her a specific reason to understand it more completely. Aldrin had indicated that the notebook's entries, while not legally necessary to the trust's validity, provided context that could be useful if the matter proceeded to a hearing. She began treating her reading as something between archival work and translation, moving through the entries with a systematic attention she had not previously applied, noting dates and cross-referencing them with the documents from the metal case. The picture that assembled itself over those weeks was more complex and more particular than she had expected. Her aunt had not built the trust from a single source of income or a single period of professional success. She had built it from a sequence of decisions, each one building on the last, each one made with a consistency of method that suggested not ambition in the conventional sense, but a kind of patient engineering. She had worked for 31 years in an advisory capacity for a firm that Clara had now researched extensively, a mid-sized financial services company that had been absorbed by a larger institution some years before her aunt's retirement. But in that role, she had been compensated well, but not extravagantly. The trust's size could not be explained by salary alone. The explanation was in the investments, tracked in the notebook, with the same precise handwriting as everything else. Her aunt had invested systematically and over a very long time horizon, in instruments she understood thoroughly, and had monitored, with a discipline that the notebook entries revealed in their consistent detail. She had reinvested returns rather than spending them. She had avoided leverage. She had declined opportunities that offered short-term gain at the cost of structural risk, documented in the notebook as a series of quiet refusals made over decades, each one annotated with a brief explanation of what had been offered and why it had been declined. The explanations were not moralistic. They were analytical. She had not been avoiding greed. She had been avoiding exposure. The word appeared several times in the notebook in a way that Clara had initially read as financial caution, a concern about visibility in the tax or regulatory sense. As she read more carefully, she came to understand it had another register as well. Her aunt had written, in an entry from roughly 20 years earlier, that the goal had never been to accumulate the largest possible sum, but to accumulate a sum large enough to be meaningful to the people it would eventually reach, while remaining invisible to people whose attention would have complicated things. Whose attention, specifically, the notebook didn't say. But the entry had been written with the deliberate restraint of someone choosing words carefully, and it pointed toward the period the earlier entries called the narrowing. It was Aldrin who told her about it, finally, in a conversation that had moved past the formal business of the estate into something more direct. He had known her aunt for 19 years, he said, but the narrowing had preceded their relationship by nearly a decade. He knew about it because her aunt had told him during one of their early meetings, in the frank and condensed way she communicated things she considered important. He described it without embellishment, as her aunt would have wanted. She had been in her mid-30s, involved professionally with a client whose affairs she had managed for several years. The relationship had been productive, and she had believed, built on a shared understanding of how things would be handled. When the client's business encountered difficulties, the response had been to assign the problems, in the accounting sense, to the advisory side of the relationship rather than to the business itself. What she had built over years of careful work became, in the legal restructuring that followed, a liability rather than an asset. She had not participated in the restructuring. She had not been asked. She had been informed. And when she had refused to sign certain documents, she had been removed from her role and replaced by someone more cooperative. She had not been charged with anything. There had been no formal finding against her. But the professional environment that followed had been shaped by the fact of her refusal, and by the way that refusal had been characterized by people with more institutional leverage than she possessed. For she had rebuilt her career, but not in the same space. She had moved to a smaller firm, taken a position that required her to start again from a lower standing, and had never spoken about what had happened in any venue where it might become a matter of record. What she had done instead was to build, slowly and with complete attention to structure, something that could not be taken from her through the kind of mechanism that had been used before. Clara sat with this information for several days. It reshaped things she had already understood, giving them a different quality without changing their basic facts. The trust was not simply an inheritance, it was a demonstration, completed over 30 years, that the method used against her aunt did not have permanent power. That what had been removed through institutional leverage could be rebuilt through patience and structural intelligence. That the accumulation of quiet decades could produce something that the people who had benefited from her removal could not reach or diminish. She had not told anyone this while she was alive. She had told the notebook, and she had told the desk. The legal challenge from Diane proceeded through its stages. Aldrin handled it with the methodical efficiency he brought to everything, producing documentation that addressed each claim in sequence and left no procedural gap unfilled. Clara attended the required hearings and answered questions with the same directness her aunt had apparently valued in her. She described finding the compartment. She described the documents. She described the letter and the instructions it contained. She did not dramatize any of it. She found that the facts, presented plainly, had a weight that dramatization would have diminished. The resolution came in the 4th month after the challenge was filed. The findings were not a victory in any triumphant sense. They were simply a confirmation that the trust was valid, its terms enforceable, its beneficiaries correctly identified. Diane received a statement from her own lawyer summarizing the outcome in formal language. She called Clara once more, and this call was shorter than the first and ended differently, not in reconciliation exactly, but in a silence that Clara recognized as the specific kind that follows grief when it runs out of the energy required to sustain itself as anger. She thought about calling back. She thought about it for several days, sitting at her aunt's desk in the morning light, reviewing in her mind what could be said that might be useful against what would likely only reopen things that had reached a necessary close. She wrote a letter instead, a short one, not about the estate and not about the legal proceedings, but about a memory she had of the two of them as children at their aunt's house, playing a game neither of them had ever been able to remember the rules of, watched from the kitchen doorway by a woman who had been, even then, paying the kind of attention that most people reserve for things that require it. She sent the letter. Diane did not reply immediately, but she did reply eventually, and the reply was brief and careful in the way of someone who had decided to try for something different. The trust administration continued through its final stages over the following months, Beneficiaries were notified and verified. Institutions received what had been designated for them. Family members who had been named in the trust's provisions went through the documentation process that Aldrin managed with his characteristic thoroughness. Clara served in the coordinating role the trust had assigned her, not as decision-maker in any unilateral sense, but as the person through whom communication flowed, the person who held the thread. She learned through this process things about her aunt's relationships that had been invisible to her from the outside. People responded to the news of the trust with reactions that revealed how well or how poorly they had understood the woman whose name was on the documents. And some were stunned in a way that suggested they had believed her aunt to be exactly what she appeared, a modest woman of modest means who had lived a careful and unremarkable life. Others seemed unsurprised in a way that suggested they had perceived something without knowing its precise dimensions that most people had missed. A few said things that Clara wrote down in a small notebook she had begun keeping, not imitating her aunt's method exactly, but finding the practice useful. Things like, "She always seemed to be measuring something," or "I never understood why she was so careful with her words," or "She used to ask questions that I didn't realize, until later I had never actually answered." The notebook she kept was not as disciplined as her aunt's. Her entries were less precise and more reflective, less organized around information, and more organized around the process of understanding information. She wrote about the desk often, about what it meant to her now versus what it had meant before she opened the compartment, about whether meaning was something objects held or something people assigned to them, and whether the distinction mattered. She wrote about her aunt in the present tense sometimes, catching herself and then leaving the correction unmade, deciding that the tense felt accurate to something even if it was not accurate to chronology. She wrote about the quality her aunt had identified in her, the one she had described in the letter as a resistance to letting things go before they had been properly seen. She was not entirely comfortable with the characterization, aware of the many things she had let go of without adequate attention over the years, aware that her decision to keep the desk had been less deliberate than her aunt's description of it implied. She wondered sometimes whether her aunt had been accurately describing an existing quality or hopefully projecting a future one, whether the letter had been a recognition or an instruction, whether, in the end, those two things were as different as they seemed. What she arrived at, through several months of this thinking, was a working understanding that she held without full confidence, but found useful. Her aunt had not been certain about her. She had been willing. That was the distinction. She had not known that Clara would press her fingers along the interior wall of the desk or resist the donation truck's claim on it. She had bet on a probability shaped by decades of observation, a probability that someone who answered when called and stayed when others left and noticed when objects had been cared for beyond their function might also, when placed in the right proximity to the right thing, notice that the thing was worth slowing down for. The probability had been correct, but it had been a probability, not a certainty, and the woman who had placed it had understood the difference. She had built the trust's legal structure to be robust enough to survive the possibility that it would not be discovered immediately, or that the person who discovered it might require time to understand what they had found. She had written the letter as though she were certain, because certainty was what the letter required. But the notebook was written in a different register, and the notebook was honest about the margins involved. Clara found this, paradoxically, more comforting than certainty would have been. It meant that what had happened was not simply the execution of a plan in which her role had been predetermined. It meant that she had made a genuine choice, even if the choice had felt more like instinct than decision in the moment. It meant that her aunt had trusted her, not because she had no doubt, but because she had weighed the doubt and found it acceptable. That was a different kind of trust, and in Clara's opinion, a more valuable one. By the time the estate was fully administered, and the last of the legal processes had concluded, she had been sitting at the secretary desk most mornings for nearly 8 months. She had developed the habit of arriving at it before the light shifted, when the east window was still in the early stages of brightening, and the wood surface held the quality her aunt had described, the quality of something that seemed to be considering its position. She did not think in those mornings about the fortune the compartment had contained, or about the legal processes it had generated, or about the family dynamics it had altered. She thought about the woman who had polished the wood for 30 years and positioned it where the light would find it, and arranged the rest of her visible life with the restraint of someone whose real investment was located elsewhere. She thought about what it required to sustain that kind of patience, not the financial discipline, which she could understand as a practice even if she could not fully imagine it, but the other kind. The patience required to watch people you cared about living lives shaped by incomplete information, and to refrain from correcting the incompleteness, not out of indifference, but out of a belief that the correction, when it came, would mean more if it arrived through discovery rather than announcement. The patience required to trust a future you would not be alive to witness, to build something for people who did not yet know they were being built for. She had read in one of her aunt's later notebook entries a sentence that she had copied into her own notebook and returned to many times since. Her aunt had written that the most enduring things she had ever seen were not the things built to last, but the things built with trust that someone else would want them to. The sentence was not explained further. It sat on its page with the self-contained completeness of something that had been written once and not revised, the kind of sentence that arrives already finished. The desk sat against the east wall of her study, catching the morning light. The compartment behind the right interior panel closed smoothly on its pivot hinge, empty now, its contents distributed to the people and purposes they had been intended for. The wood held its polish. The brass pulls on the shallow drawers were worn smooth in the way of things that had been handled over long time by careful hands. Sometimes, sitting at the writing surface in the early hours before the rest of the day assembled its demands, she would press her fingertips against the interior wall, not to check whether anything remained, but simply to feel the mechanism, the quiet. Give of the hinge, the slight resistance, and then the release. She did not think of it as ritual, exactly. She thought of it as the same thing her aunt had practiced for 30 years on the visible surface of the wood, a form of attendance that did not require a reason beyond the fact of the object and its history, and the willingness to remain with both long enough to understand what they were telling her. The light moved across the desk as the morning advanced. The room settled into its daily rhythm. Outside, the world proceeded with the indifference it brought to everything that was not yet ready to be noticed. And in the small study on the east side of the house, a woman sat at her inheritance and paid it the attention it was owed. If this story stayed with you, make sure to subscribe, because more stories like this one are coming. Stories about hidden things and the people patient enough to find them. Watch the next video on the channel. Share this one with someone who knows the value of slowing down, and tell us in the comments what you would have done if you had been the one to open that compartment. The first thing she did with her portion of the inheritance was nothing. This was not paralysis or indecision. It was deliberate. A choice she made during one of her early morning sessions at the desk, after reading again the entry in the notebook where her aunt had written about the difference between money held still and money put into motion, and about how the former, in the right circumstances, was not passivity, but preparation. She had grown up in a world that treated inaction as failure and speed as virtue, and she understood well enough by now that her aunt had spent a lifetime operating according to a different logic, one in which the value of waiting was measured by what the waiting made possible rather than what it cost. So she waited. She continued her work, which was in the field of educational program development, for a nonprofit organization that served first-generation college students, a role she had held for 6 years and found meaningful in a way that had survived the kind of attrition that eventually diminishes most sources of meaning. She paid her regular expenses. She did not tell her colleagues about the estate. She sat at the desk most mornings and read, or thought, or simply let the light move across the wood surface, while her mind moved through questions that did not yet have answers, but were becoming more precisely shaped with each passing week. The question she returned to most often was the one the trust's final documents had left deliberately open. Her aunt had specified in the legal instrument that a portion of the estate was to be held in a continued trust structure, administered by Clara, for purposes she had described in characteristically indirect terms as the support of people whose useful work has been made invisible through circumstances beyond their control. The phrasing was her aunt's own, inserted into the legal language with a specificity that Aldrin had initially questioned, but her aunt had insisted upon. She had known what she meant. She had expected the person administering it to work out the rest. Clara spent 3 months working out the rest. She spoke with Aldrin at length about the legal parameters of what the language permitted. She read about philanthropic structures and about the organizations that had attempted, with varying degrees of success, to address the particular category of harm her aunt had described. She thought about her aunt's own experience, the professional narrowing, the removal from a role she had built and occupied with integrity, the decade of rebuilding that had followed. She thought about the people who had not rebuilt, who had encountered the same kind of mechanism and had not possessed, or had not been given access to, the resources and resilience that her aunt had eventually assembled. The picture that formed was not abstract. It was populated by specific kinds of people in specific kinds of situations. Workers whose injuries had been administratively managed rather than medically treated. Employees whose documented concerns about workplace practices had been resolved not by addressing the practices, but by eliminating the employees. Professionals whose careers had been quietly obstructed after they declined to participate in things they found wrong. People who had made the choice her aunt had made and had paid the cost her aunt had paid, and had not, in most cases, spent the following 30 years building a hidden trust to demonstrate that the cost had not been the final word. Subscribe and let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what you would have done with an inheritance like this one. She consulted with 3 people whose work she respected and whose judgment she had tested over time. One was a labor attorney who had spent 20 years representing workers in wrongful termination cases and who described, when Clara outlined what she was considering, a landscape of need that was both larger and more specific than she had imagined. One was a woman who ran a small organization providing financial bridges to whistleblowers during the period between a complaint's filing and its resolution, a gap that could last years and during which the person who had filed the complaint often had no income and no professional prospects. The third was a former colleague who now worked in policy research and who provided, over a long afternoon conversation, a structural analysis of how invisibility was manufactured in professional contexts and what interventions had historically been most effective at countering it. By the time she was ready to move, she had a framework. It was not a grand institution or a flagship initiative. It was smaller and more specific than that, deliberately so, designed on a principle she had extracted from her aunt's notebook and tested against her own experience. Her aunt had written in one of the entries from the middle period of the notebook that the most effective forms of help were the ones that arrived at the precise moment when the person receiving them had just enough foundation to use them. Too early, and the help supplied what effort would have built. Too late, and it arrived after the need had calcified into something else. The timing, she had written, was the whole of the craft. What Clara built over the following year was a small grants program, housed within an existing foundation structure that Aldrin helped her identify and establish a relationship with. Its focus was narrow: financial support for people in the period immediately following a professionally damaging refusal, defined specifically as a refusal to participate in conduct they had documented as harmful. The grants were not large. They were designed to cover 6 months of living expenses and access to legal counsel, enough to prevent the specific kind of collapse that occurred when someone's income disappeared at the same moment their legal costs began to rise. Enough, in her aunt's terms, to give someone just enough foundation to use what they already had. The application process was simple by design. She had reviewed enough grant structures to recognize the ways in which complexity served administrators more than applicants, and had built something that required documentation without requiring the performance of need that most application processes demanded. Aldrin reviewed it with the same thoroughness he brought to everything and suggested 3 adjustments that she accepted because they improved the structure rather than changing its intent. The first grants went out in the program's 4th month of operation. There were 7 of them, to 7 people in 7 different industries, whose situations she had reviewed personally and whose documentation she had found, in each case, both credible and representative of exactly the category her aunt had described. She did not tell most people about the program. It was not a secret, exactly, but it was not publicized either. People who needed it found it through the attorney network and through the organization that served whistleblowers and through the slow, or word-of-mouth transmission that occurs in communities of people who have been through similar things. She received letters sometimes, handwritten ones, from people whose situations had changed because of the bridge the grants had provided. She kept these letters in the shallow drawer of the secretary desk that had once held pen nibs and a dried inkwell. The drawer that had always been there, visible and unremarkable, sitting above the compartment that had held everything else. Diane reached out again in the program's 2nd year. The contact was tentative and arrived through a message rather than a call, a form of communication that preserved the option of non-response in a way that Clara recognized as deliberate and respected. Diane had read something about the program, she wrote, or in an industry publication that had run a brief piece about it, without naming Clara directly, but with enough identifying information that someone paying attention could make the connection. She said she had not expected this. She said she was not sure why she was writing, except that she thought she should say something, and was not yet sure what that something was. Clara wrote back the same day. She did not explain the program, or justify it, or invite Diane's opinion of it. She wrote about their aunt, specifically about a thing their aunt had said to her once during a visit that she had not understood at the time and had been understanding slowly ever since. Their aunt had said, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation about nothing in particular, that the people who made things last were usually the people who were not trying to make things last, who were simply trying to do the right thing in the present moment, and had discovered, over time, that this approach had a better structural record than any of the alternatives. Clara had thought at the time that her aunt was talking about furniture. Diane replied to this message with something that took Clara a moment to identify as laughter, communicated in the flat medium of text with a directness she had not expected. She said she had always found their aunt slightly impenetrable and had never been sure whether the impenetrability was a personality trait or a method. Clara wrote back that she had concluded it was both and that the combination was probably intentional. They exchanged 4 more messages over the following week, short ones, each one a little less careful than the last. Nothing was resolved between them in any formal sense. There was no conversation in which the legal proceedings were addressed or the grief of exclusion was fully processed. There was simply a gradual reestablishment of contact that asked nothing except its own continuation. It was not until the program's third year that Clara understood the full scope of what her aunt had built. Not financially. She had understood the financial dimensions for some time, but architecturally. She had been reviewing grant applications one morning at the desk, moving through the documentation with the focused attention the work required, when she noticed something she had seen before but not fully registered. 2 of the applications in the current cycle referenced situations at companies that appeared, on further investigation, to share a corporate parent. A third, filed 6 months earlier and already resolved, referenced a subsidiary of the same parent. She spent 2 days tracing the connections before calling Aldrin. What he told her did not surprise her in the way dramatic revelations are supposed to surprise people. It settled into her with the specific weight of something she had been approaching for a long time without knowing she was approaching it. The corporate parent, now operating under a name it had assumed following a merger, was the successor to the firm that had employed her aunt 30 years earlier, the firm whose restructuring had been used to remove her aunt from her role, and the firm whose institutional leverage had made the professional environment that followed so difficult. The firm her aunt had never named in the notebook, but had circled, consistently, in the decisions she had made about where to direct the trust's ongoing resources. She sat with this information for a long time, looking at the morning light on the desk's surface. Her aunt had not built the program. She had built the trust and had defined its purpose in language general enough to be genuinely broad, genuinely applicable to many situations and many industries. But the specificity of the language, the precision of the harm described, the category of person identified, these had been drawn from something her aunt knew intimately and had chosen not to name. In not naming it, she had made the program larger than a personal grievance, and she had translated private experience into structural principle. And the structural principle, administered by someone who did not know its origin story and therefore could not be limited by it, had arrived, through the ordinary mechanics of need and documentation, at exactly the place it had been designed to address. Clara did not know how to feel about this. She spent several days not knowing, which was, she had learned, a legitimate response to things that genuinely required time. She was not angry at her aunt for the indirection. She understood it. She was not certain she would have done differently in the same position, and she was not certain it would have been better if she had. What the indirection had preserved was a program with genuine integrity, or one whose administrator had made decisions on the merits without any awareness of a personal history that might have complicated those decisions. The fact that the merits, followed faithfully, had arrived at this outcome was either a coincidence or evidence of something her aunt had understood about the relationship between structural principle and specific origin that Clara was still working out. She wrote it in her notebook, imprecisely at first, and then more carefully on a second attempt. She wrote that her aunt had translated a harm done to a person into a harm done to a category, and had then built something that addressed the category without requiring anyone to know about the person. That this was either a form of exceptional selflessness or a form of exceptional strategy or both. Now, and that the distinction between selflessness and strategy was one she found increasingly difficult to maintain when she looked closely at people who had done genuinely useful things with their lives. Her aunt had not been sentimental about the distinction. She had simply gotten on with it. The program continued. The corporate parent, under scrutiny from multiple directions now, entered a period of significant legal and regulatory difficulty that Clara followed in the business press with the attentive neutrality of someone who had relevant information but had not chosen to make herself its carrier. Other people were doing that work. People with different tools and different positions and different relationships to the story. Her aunt had understood this too. Aunt had understood that the most effective interventions were often the ones made from the side rather than the front. That addressing a structure at multiple points simultaneously, each point seemingly independent, was more durable than any single frontal confrontation. She thought often, in those years, about the other people who had passed through the company's various mechanisms, the ones whose situations had been arranged and managed and resolved in ways that removed them from the record. She did not know their names. She did not have access to the particular history of each case. What she had was the program, and the program had found some of them. Not all, never all, but some. The ones who had documentation. The ones who had been connected by the slow networks of people who had been through similar things. The ones who had needed a bridge precisely when a bridge had been available. 4 years after the estate had been settled, she visited the house one last time. It had been sold as part of the estate administration, purchased by a family who had already moved in and who had transformed it, gently but completely, into a space organized around a different life. The east-facing rooms where her aunt had kept the desk were now a child's bedroom, its walls painted a bright yellow that was as far from the desk's deep reddish-brown as color could manage. She stood outside on the street and looked at the house from a distance, not wanting to intrude, simply wanting to see it once more in the context of continued habitation. She had not expected to feel what she felt, which was a kind of satisfaction that had nothing elegiac in it. The house was alive. It was doing what houses were built to do. The woman who had lived in it for decades and had polished a desk in its living room and had arranged a fortune in a hidden compartment and had waited with extraordinary patience for the right person to arrive had accomplished what she had set out to accomplish. The house did not need to remain hers in order for her work to continue. The work was continuing in other places, in the grants program, and in the letters in the desk drawer, and in the slow reconstitution of contact with Diane, and in the morning light on a writing surface that now sat in a different room entirely, tended by different hands. She drove back through an afternoon that had the particular quality of late autumn, the light low and specific, making familiar things look newly considered. She thought about beginnings, about how many of the things she now understood had been present, already fully formed, in the moment she had stood in a living room and decided that a piece of furniture deserved more attention than a donation truck. She had not known she was deciding anything consequential. She had simply been doing what her aunt had apparently observed her doing across enough years to build a probability around, staying with something past the point of its obvious reward, attending to it until it disclosed what it contained. The desk was at home when she returned, in the east-facing room, in the morning light, as it would be the next morning and the morning after that. She sat at the writing surface for a while before starting any work, running her fingers along the interior walls, feeling the familiar give of the hinge, the slight resistance, and then the release. The compartment was empty. It had been empty for years and would remain so, its function completed, its contents distributed to the places and people they had always been intended to reach. But the mechanism was intact, the hinge still smooth, the panel still fitted with the same deliberate precision with which it had been installed by hands she would never know anything about except what their work revealed. She did not think of this as an ending. Her aunt had not thought in those terms, had not organized her life around conclusions, but around continuations, around the question of what came next and how to build something that could survive the transition from one set of hands to another. The notebook was on the desk beside her, and beside it was her own notebook, and its pages increasingly filled with entries that were becoming, without her having planned it, more precise and less reflective, more concerned with information and structure, and less concerned with the process of understanding them. She noticed this shift with the same quality of attention she had been learning to apply to everything, and made a note about it, and then got on with the work. Outside, the morning was doing what mornings did, advancing through its stages with the indifference that is not coldness, but simply scale. The world too large and too continuous to pause for any particular moment within it. Inside, A woman sat at her inheritance and did what she had been trusted to do, which was not to preserve it or protect it or manage it from a careful distance, but to use it with the same patient intelligence that had built it, in the service of the purpose it had been built for. The light moved across the desk. The work continued, and in the slow accumulation of days that such work requires, the shape of something durable was assembling itself, quietly, without announcement, in the manner of all things built to last. The letter that changed the second chapter of everything arrived on a Wednesday in February, the kind of month that does not announce itself, but simply persists. Clara had been at the desk for an hour by the time she found it among the day's correspondence, a single white envelope with no return address and handwriting on the front that she did not recognize. The envelope had been forwarded through the Foundation, which meant someone had found the program's address through the proper channels and had chosen, for reasons that would become apparent later, to use paper rather than the digital submission portal she had designed for exactly this purpose. She opened it with the letter opener her aunt had kept in the shallow drawer, the one she had found there on the night of the first discovery, and had claimed without fully understanding why. Inside was a single folded page, and, paper-clipped to it, a photograph. She read the page first, as she always did with correspondence, that had been routed through the Foundation, applying the same quality of attention she brought to everything that arrived through that channel, which meant reading for the particular emotional register beneath the factual content, for the shape of the situation as opposed to its explicit description. The writer was a woman named Rosalind, 61 years old, who had worked for 34 years as an actuary at a firm she did not name in the letter, but referenced by its initials that Clara recognized before she reached the end of the first paragraph. She had seen them in her aunt's notebook. She had seen them in the corporate genealogy she had traced 3 years earlier. She set the letter down and looked at the wall for a moment, then picked it up and continued reading. Rosalind had not come to the program through the usual routes. She had not been referred by a labor attorney or connected through the whistleblower support network. She had found the program through a different path, one she described in the letter with a deliberateness that suggested she understood its significance. She had found it through a woman named Margaret, now in her late 70s, who had known Clara's aunt, whose name she spelled out in full in the letter, not as a reference point, but as a center of gravity, the thing around which her own story had been orbiting for decades without her having known what to call it. Margaret had been, for a period of 8 years in the 1980s, a colleague and close friend of Clara's aunt. She was, Rosalind wrote, the single trusted friend referenced in the notebook's middle entries, the witness rather than the advisor, the person who had been asked to verify rather than counsel. Clara understood immediately that this letter was not an application. It was a contact, made carefully and from a distance by someone who was offering information rather than requesting help. She read the second half of the letter with this understanding in place and found that it held. Rosalind had encountered the same firm, the same mechanisms, the same category of pressure that her aunt had encountered 30 years earlier, and that the program had been designed to address. Her situation was not ongoing. It had resolved, or rather, it had reached the kind of terminus that was not resolution, but simply cessation, the point at which the machinery had finished what it was doing and had moved on to other operations. She had survived it. She was writing not for herself, but because Margaret had told her, recently, that the niece was doing something, and that the something seemed to be related to a thing her aunt had once said she hoped someone would eventually do, and that Rosalind might have information that would be useful to the niece if the niece was interested. The photograph was still paper-clipped to the back of the page. She unfolded it carefully. It was a snapshot, not a formal portrait, taken at what appeared to be an outdoor gathering of some kind, a summer afternoon, the light behind the subjects bright and slightly overexposed in the way of photographs from the period before digital correction. 4 women stood in a loose group, turned toward the camera, with the natural ease of people who are among friends rather than posing for record. Clara recognized her aunt immediately, younger than in any photograph she had seen before, mid-30s perhaps, wearing an expression she had never been able to observe in life, open and unheld, the expression of someone who has not yet needed to develop the discipline of concealment. Beside her stood a woman Clara did not recognize, and beside that woman stood 2 others she also did not know. Written on the back of the photograph in handwriting that was not her aunt's was a date and 4 names: Eleanor, Margaret, Rosalind, Joan. She sat for a long time with the photograph on the desk in front of her. The morning light was doing what it always did, moving across the wood surface in its unhurried way, indifferent to the weight of what it was illuminating. She thought about the word Eleanor, which was her aunt's name, a name she had heard spoken hundreds of times, and which somehow looked different, written by someone else's hand on the back of a photograph from a summer afternoon 40 years gone. She thought about the fact that she had spent 4 years administering a trust built by a woman she had known as Aunt Eleanor, as a presence defined by its relation to her own life, and had been understanding slowly that this relation was one small angle of a geometry that extended in directions she had not been looking. She called Aldrin that afternoon. He listened to her description of the letter with the silence of someone who is processing rather than waiting to speak. And when he did speak, it was to ask a single clarifying question about the name Margaret, which told her that the name was not unfamiliar to him. He confirmed, after a pause that was not quite hesitation, but carried the same quality of care, that a Margaret appeared in the earliest documentation he had reviewed when he first took on her aunt's case, referenced as a verification contact for a transaction that had been made in the trust's formative period. He had never been given her last name. He had never needed it. She had been present in the record as a function rather than as a person. Clara wrote back to Rosalind the next day. She did not write through the Foundation's official channels. She wrote on personal stationery, by hand, in a register that was not the register of the program administrator, but of the niece. She said she was grateful for the letter and the photograph. She said she would very much like to speak with Margaret if Margaret was willing, and with Rosalind also if that felt appropriate, and that she understood if it did not yet. She said she was writing by hand because the letter she had received had been written by hand, and she thought the form was a kind of communication in itself, a signal about the quality of attention one intended to bring to the exchange. And she was not certain this observation was correct, but she sent the letter anyway, because her aunt had written in the notebook that the willingness to be slightly imprecise in the service of genuine connection was a more useful trait than the precision that protected against misunderstanding at the cost of contact. The reply came 2 weeks later, also by hand, from Rosalind, who wrote that Margaret would speak with her and who included a phone number and a suggested time. The call was set for a Saturday morning. Clara prepared for it the way she prepared for things that mattered, which was to do very little except be present, having learned from 4 years of administering the program that the conversations that produced the most useful information were usually the ones she had entered, with the fewest predetermined questions. She had her notebook open. She had a cup of tea. She had the photograph on the desk in front of her, so that the woman she was about to speak with existed for her as a face rather than a name. Margaret's voice was the voice of someone in her late 70s who had been a person of precision her entire life and remained so, her sentences complete, her pauses thoughtful, her descriptions exact without being technical. She began by saying that she had wondered for some years whether this conversation would happen, and had concluded eventually that it would, because Eleanor had built it to happen, and Eleanor didn't build things carelessly. This observation, delivered without ceremony, established immediately the register in which the conversation would proceed. They were not talking about a dead woman. They were talking about an ongoing intelligence, expressed now in the structures she had left behind, still operating in the way that careful constructions continue to operate after the people who built them are gone. Margaret had met Eleanor in their early 30s, through the professional network of the financial services sector, in a mid-sized city that was large enough to have a sector, but small enough for the people within it to know each other by more than reputation. They had recognized each other, she said, in the way that people with similar internal orientations recognize each other, not because they were alike in personality or background, but because they were alike in the thing they were paying attention to and in the conclusions they had drawn from paying attention to it. Eleanor had been, even then, a careful person, not cold and not withholding, but careful. She chose what she offered and to whom, and she chose based on observation rather than sentiment, which was unusual and which Margaret had found, after years of experience with the alternative, to be a form of profound respect. The period she called the narrowing had preceded Margaret's knowledge of it. Eleanor had told her about it some years after it occurred, in a conversation that Margaret described as the most direct and unsentimental accounting of harm she had ever received from another person. Eleanor had explained what had happened with the precision of someone who had already processed the emotion and was now presenting the information, not because the emotion was gone, but because the emotion had been placed somewhere it could not interfere with the clarity of the account. She had described the mechanism without exaggeration. She had described the decision to rebuild without dramatizing it. And she had described, at the end of the conversation, what she intended to do about it, which at that point was still in its early stages, still more intention than structure, but which Margaret had understood immediately was not a plan, but a commitment. She had been asked to serve as a witness, not a legal witness in any formal sense, but in the older sense of the word, someone who knows, and whose knowing constitutes a record that exists outside the documents and the institutions and the people who might someday want those documents to say something other than what they said. Eleanor had asked her to remember the conversation, to remember the intention, to be, if it became necessary, someone who could confirm that what appeared in the structures that would eventually materialize had been there from the beginning, had not been improvised or constructed after the fact to serve purposes the original design had not contained. Margaret had agreed, and she had kept the agreement for 40 years, and she was keeping it still, she said, in the conversation with Clara, which she understood to be part of what keeping the agreement required. The conversation lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Clara had 3 pages of notes and a revised understanding of several things she had believed she understood. The grants program, Margaret confirmed, had not been an accident of her aunt's general charitable intent. It had been the specific form of a specific vision that Eleanor had described to her, on imprecisely at first, and then with increasing clarity over the years of their friendship, as the trust grew and the legal structure solidified, and the nature of what she was building became more apparent to her. She had not known, Margaret said, exactly how it would manifest. She had not known whether the person who administered it would understand its lineage, or whether the lineage would matter to its operation. She had decided that it did not need to matter, that the structural principle was sound enough to arrive at its purpose without the administrator needing to know the personal history behind it. But she had also, Margaret said with something that was not quite a smile but carried its warmth, told Margaret that if the person turned out to be someone who would want to know, she hoped Margaret would still be around to tell them. And there was a detail toward the end of the call that Clara had not expected, and that required her to set down her pen and simply listen. Margaret said that Eleanor had, in the final years before her death, been in contact with two people whose situations bore directly on the history of the firm. She had not approached them. She had been approached through the slow networks that connected people who had been through similar things. She had provided documentation to both of them, documentation she had preserved from the period of the narrowing, material she had retained with the same methodical care she brought to everything, material that had been used, in both cases, in proceedings that had not yet been publicly resolved at the time of Eleanor's death, but that were still ongoing. The people who had approached her had not known about the trust. Eleanor had not told them. She had helped them because their cause was legitimate, and because the documentation she held was relevant, and because helping them was the right thing to do, and these reasons had been sufficient without requiring any connection to the larger structure she had spent 30 years building. Clara did not know what to do with this for several days. She held it in the way her aunt had apparently held things, not trying to resolve it prematurely, letting it sit in her awareness, while her awareness continued to move through the ordinary requirements of her daily life. She went to work. She reviewed grant applications. She sat at the desk in the mornings. She wrote in her notebook without trying to write about the things she was processing, and trusting that when she was ready to write about it, the words would come with the appropriate precision. They came on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the call, in an entry that she read back to herself after writing it, and found to be not perfect, but true. She had written that her aunt had lived a life that operated on two registers simultaneously, the visible and the structural, and that the relationship between the two was not deception, but architecture. The visible life had been genuine. The modest house, the careful routines, the quality of presence she had brought to the people she cared about, none of these had been performance. They had been the surface of something whose depth she had not chosen to display, not because the depth was shameful, but because display would have changed it, and would have transformed intention into statement, and made it vulnerable to being interpreted rather than simply being effective. She had understood, before she had the language for it, the principle that the most durable forms of influence were the ones that did not announce themselves. That arrived, when they arrived, not as interventions, but as structures that had been in place long enough to feel inevitable. She called Rosalind the following week. The conversation was shorter than the one with Margaret, but equally precise. Rosalind had worked at the firm for a period that overlapped with a significant portion of what Eleanor had built, though she had not known Eleanor personally, and had not known about the trust or the program until Margaret had told her. What she had was a different kind of knowledge, the knowledge of someone who had been inside the mechanism during the years when the mechanism was most active, who had observed its operations from the position of a professional performing legitimate work within an institution that was using legitimate work as structural cover for other things. She had not participated in those other things. She had refused in a specific and documented way, and the consequences of that refusal had been the kind that the program was designed to address. What she was offering was not testimony in the legal sense. The legal proceedings that concerned her were already moving through their own processes, managed by people with the appropriate expertise and standing. What she was offering was something more like context, of the understanding of a person who had been present at a particular confluence of forces and had retained, through the years since, a clear picture of how those forces related to each other. She had read, she told Clara, about the program. She had understood its design immediately, not just as a grants mechanism, but as an expression of a philosophy, and she had recognized the philosophy. She had encountered it once before, briefly and indirectly, in a conversation with a woman she had met at a professional conference in the early 1990s, a woman who had said something about structure and patience that Rosalind had written down and kept and had never been able to fully attribute until Margaret had given her the name. Clara asked her what the woman had said. Rosalind read it from a paper she had apparently kept for 30 years, long in a handwriting that was not her own, transcribed in the moment because it had seemed important and proven, across 3 decades, to be exactly as important as it had seemed. Eleanor had said, "The most powerful thing a person can do is to build something that continues to correct the harm after the person who built it is no longer present to be afraid of the correction." Rosalind had not known in the early 90s what harm Eleanor was referring to. She knew now. She had read the words back to herself many times in the months since Margaret had filled in the context, and each time they clarified something different about the situation she had herself survived, about the decision she had made to refuse, about the long and difficult years that had followed the refusal, about the way she was sitting now in her early 60s, intact and functional, and speaking on the phone with the niece of a woman she had met once at a conference, and whose work, it turned out, had been circling her own story for 30 years. The photograph from the letter had been sitting on Clara's desk since the day it arrived. She had looked at it many times, studying the 4 faces with the specific attention of someone who understands that a photograph is not a record of a moment, but a document of a relationship, of the particular quality of ease and recognition that exists between people who have chosen each other. She had looked at her aunt's face most often, at the openness of the expression she had never observed in life, trying to understand not what it revealed about the young woman in the photograph, but what it said about the process by which the open expression had become the careful one. The person who stood easily in the afternoon light among friends had become the person who polished a desk for 30 years and waited with extraordinary patience for someone to notice that the polish was intentional. She thought she understood it now in a way she hadn't at the beginning. The openness hadn't disappeared. It had been placed somewhere it could be protected while it was used. Her aunt had not closed. She had reorganized, had found a form for what she valued that could survive in the environment that existed after the narrowing, an environment that had punished certain kinds of visibility while leaving other kinds, less legible to the people doing the punishing, intact. The care she had brought to the people she loved, the quality of presence she had offered at kitchen tables and during holiday visits, and in the small, unexpected notes she had sent without occasion, these had been expressions of the same thing as the trust and the program and the documentation she had provided to people pursuing legitimate proceedings. The surface and the structure had been the same in their orientation, different only in their form. Subscribe and tell us in the comments, have you ever discovered that someone you thought you knew had been doing something quietly extraordinary the whole time? Tell us where you are watching from and what that discovery felt like. Diane came to visit in the spring of the 5th year. She had not been to Clara's home before, and the visit had been arranged with the careful tentative scheduling of people who have established something fragile between them and are not yet sure of its weight-bearing capacity. Clara had made tea and had cleared a space at the kitchen table and had decided not to place the desk in any special prominence, to simply let it occupy its room in its ordinary way and allow it to be encountered naturally if it was encountered at all. She was aware that this decision was itself a form of arrangement, that the choice not to curate was still a choice, but she had found that the most honest approach to Diane, since they had cautiously resumed contact, was to do the ordinary thing and let the ordinary thing carry what it could. Diane noticed the desk immediately. She had walked through the house with the interested attention of someone seeing a space for the first time and wanting to understand it, and she had stopped in the doorway of the study with the specific quality of stillness that Clara had come to associate with genuine recognition rather than polite admiration. She stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, then said that it was exactly where it should be, and that the light was right. Clara said that the light was why she had placed it there, that it had been placed according to a specific instruction. Diane looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the desk, then said she remembered the desk from when they were children, that she had always thought it was just a piece of furniture their aunt particularly liked. They sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. The conversation moved through territories that had not been available to them before, through the legal period and its residue, through their individual memories of their aunt, through the ways in which those memories had been altered by what they now knew and the ways in which they had remained stubbornly unchanged, the specific texture of a particular afternoon, or the exact quality of a particular laugh resistant to revision by subsequent information. Diane talked about the Sunday phone calls with a honesty that surprised Clara, acknowledging that they had been, in the beginning, genuinely meaningful, and that at some point, without her fully noticing, they had become habitual, had shifted from connection to maintenance, and that she had not examined the shift because the maintenance had felt like enough. She said she was not sure now whether their aunt had noticed the shift or had simply waited for it to correct itself. Clara did not answer this question directly because she did not know the answer, and because the not knowing seemed important to preserve. She had learned, through the years of administering the program and reading the notebook and speaking with Margaret and Rosalind, that her aunt had been a careful observer, but not a judge, had been someone who gathered information and drew conclusions, but held those conclusions with a lightness that allowed them to be revised if new information arrived. Whether Eleanor had noticed the shift in Diane's calls and had made a decision about it, or had noticed and decided to wait, or had not noticed at all, was something that would remain inaccessible. The notebook did not address Diane specifically. Aldrin had no relevant information. Margaret had said only that Eleanor had spoken about her family with the same measured care she brought to everything, which meant that whatever she had thought about any of them had been something she had thought precisely and had chosen to keep. They walked through the house before Diane left, not as a tour, but as a natural extension of the conversation, moving from room to room in the easy way of people who are finding that they are more comfortable with each other than they had expected to be. When they reached the study, Diane stood at the desk and ran her hand along its surface, the way Clara had seen people touch things they are trying to understand through contact rather than observation. She opened the writing surface and looked at the interior, at the cubby holes and the shallow drawers, and then looked at Clara with a question that she did not ask verbally, but that was legible in the quality of her attention. Clara showed her the panel. She pressed her fingers to the right interior wall and felt the slight resistance, and then the release, and the panel swung inward on its hinge, and Diane leaned forward and looked into the empty compartment for a long time without saying anything. What she said when she finally spoke was not what Clara had expected. She said that she thought she understood now why Clara had kept it. Not the fortune, which had been distributed and which would have been distributed regardless of who kept the desk, but the desk itself, the physical object with its hidden mechanism and its empty compartment and its morning light. She said she thought it was because the desk was the argument, the clearest possible expression of what their aunt had believed about attention and patience and the relationship between visible surfaces and hidden structures. That to keep it was not sentimentality, it was understanding. Clara looked at her cousin across the surface of the desk that had changed everything and thought that the probability her aunt had calculated 30 years earlier had not accounted for this moment, this specific convergence, but that it had been built from the same quality of observation that made the moment possible. That the probability and the moment were both expressions of the same intelligence operating across different scales of time. Aldrin retired at the end of the year. He handled the transition with the thoroughness he had brought to every other aspect of his professional relationship with the estate, introducing Clara to his successor in a meeting that was methodical and complete, and at the end of which, Clara understood exactly what the transition entailed and felt no uncertainty about the continuity of the trust's administration. He stayed after the successor left, and they spoke for a while in the way of people who have worked together long enough to have developed a form of communication that does not require much scaffolding. He said he had found the work connected to the estate to be among the most satisfying of his career, by which he did not mean remunerative, and that he had understood from the first meeting with Eleanor 19 years earlier that he was being asked to do something that had a larger purpose than the sum of its technical requirements. He said she had told him at that first meeting that she was building something for people she had not yet identified, and that the people would identify themselves through the act of needing what she was building. He had found this, he said, to be exactly accurate. Clara asked him whether he had known, at any point during the 19 years, what the corporate connection was, the relationship between the trust's design and the firm whose history her aunt had spent 3 decades quietly addressing. He was quiet for a moment, then said that he had known in the sense that an attentive person, reviewing the documentation over many years, would eventually perceive a shape, even if the shape was not explained, and he had not known the personal history. He had not been given it. But he had understood, from the structure of the legal instruments and from certain choices Eleanor had made about the framing of the trust's purpose, that there was a personal history, and that the history had the specific character of harm that had been carefully converted into something corrective. He had not asked about it because he had not needed to know. He had needed to build what she described, and he had built it, and it had operated as she had intended. That was, he said, a good result. Not a complete one, not one that erased what had been done, but a good one in the specific sense that it had produced something lasting from something that had been designed to leave nothing. She walked him out after the meeting, standing at the door of the building where the foundation maintained its administrative office, watching him move down the street with the steady pace of someone who has been walking somewhere for a long time and sees no reason to change the pace now. She thought about the 19 years he had spent in the service of a structure he had helped build without knowing its full origin, the quality of professional fidelity that required. She thought about the word fidelity, and about how it was related to the word faith, and about how both were ultimately about the willingness to act in service of something larger than your own complete understanding of it. Her aunt had built the trust on the assumption that people like Aldrin existed, people who would do the work without requiring the full story. She had also built it on the assumption that people like Clara existed, people who would eventually want the full story and would be capable of doing something useful with it. The program entered its 6th year with a structure that had evolved from its original design without departing from its original intent, which was, Clara had come to understand, the best possible result for something built on her aunt's principles. The grants had increased in number as the network of referral sources grew, and the program's reputation, moving through the slow channels of people who had been through particular kinds of difficulty, reached people who were in the acute phase of exactly the situation the grants were designed to address. The documentation requirements had been refined through 6 years of processing applications on becoming more precise without becoming more demanding, which was a distinction Clara had come to believe was fundamental and which she had written about in her notebook more than once. She had hired, in the program's 4th year, a part-time administrator named Priya, who was 29 years old and had come to the role through the Whistleblower Support Network, not as a recipient, but as a volunteer, and who had demonstrated, in 6 months of volunteering, the specific quality of attention that the program required. Clara had recognized it before she had articulated what she was looking for, in the way her aunt had apparently recognized it in her, through observation rather than criteria. Priya processed applications with care and communicated with applicants with a directness that acknowledged their difficulty without reducing them to it. She asked good questions. She held information carefully. She was building, Clara thought, the kind of professional self that would be difficult to misuse and impossible to simply redirect. She had told Priya, at their 6-month review, about the program's origin. Not the financial details, which were documented and available, but the personal history, the narrowing, the trust, the desk, the compartment. She had told her about Eleanor, and about Margaret, and about the conversation with Rosalind, and about the notebook, and about the photograph of 4 women on a summer afternoon. She had told her because Priya was going to need the context, not immediately, but eventually. And because waiting to provide it would only make the eventual provision feel withheld rather than timed. Her aunt had waited to provide context because the recipient had not yet arrived at the position where the context would be useful. Clara judged that Priya had arrived, and she acted accordingly. Priya had listened to all of it with the attentiveness that had recommended her for the role, and at the end had asked a single question that Clara had been asked before by different people in different registers, but that Priya asked with a specific quality of genuine inquiry that made Clara want to answer carefully. She asked whether Clara thought the program was working, not in the administrative sense, not in terms of grants distributed and situations stabilized, but in the larger sense, the sense Eleanor had apparently intended, whether it was doing what it had been built to do. Clara had considered the question for a moment before answering, looking at the wall where she kept, in this office, a copy of the photograph that sat on the desk at home. The original was still there, still paper-clipped to the letter that Rosalind had sent, still resting in the compartment that had once held a fortune, and now held the letters she received from people whose situations had been changed by the bridge the grants provided. She had moved them there, the letters, not as symbolism, but because the compartment was the right size and the drawer below the cubbyholes had become too full. The practical decision had turned out to feel appropriate in a way that practical decisions sometimes did. So she had told Priya that she thought the program was working in the sense that it was continuing, which was what working meant for something built on Eleanor's principles. That it had found people it was designed to find, and had provided what those people needed at the moment they needed it, and that some of those people had gone on to do things that had further addressed the conditions that had required the program to exist in the first place, and that this propagation was not a strategy Eleanor had built in, but a natural consequence of providing the right kind of support at the right moment to people who had the capacity and the will to use it. That the program was, therefore, not simply distributing resources, but participating in a longer process of correction that it had not initiated and would not conclude, but was advancing, and in its particular way, from its particular position. She had also told Priya, because honesty required it, that the program was not working in the sense that the harm it addressed was still being produced at a rate that outpaced the correction, that the mechanisms Eleanor had spent 30 years addressing had adapted and diversified and found new forms, and that a grants program, however well designed, was addressing symptoms rather than causes, and that addressing symptoms while causes continued was a form of maintenance rather than cure. She did not say this to diminish what the program did. She said it because Priya was building a professional self, and professional selves built on incomplete pictures of the problems they were addressing eventually found the incompleteness in ways that were more costly than finding it earlier through honesty. Priya had nodded and had said that she understood, and had asked, after a pause that was thoughtful rather than uncertain, whether there was something else that could be done from this position, something that addressed causes rather than symptoms, while remaining within what this particular structure was capable of. It was, Clara thought, exactly the right question. It was the kind of question her aunt had apparently asked herself sometime in her mid-30s, after the narrowing, when she had understood that rebuilding her professional life was the necessary work of the immediate period, but was not the whole of what she intended to do. It was the question that preceded the construction of something durable. She did not have a complete answer for Priya on the day the question was asked. She had partial answers, elements of a response that she laid out as partial answers rather than as a complete picture, because presenting partial answers as complete ones was the habit of people who needed to appear more certain than they were, and she had no use for that appearance. She said that the program's documentation was extensive and potentially useful to people working on systemic levels, that the patterns in 6 years of applications contained information about the mechanisms of professional harm that was not available in any other form, and that there were researchers and advocates and regulatory bodies that would benefit from access to a curated version of that pattern data in a form that protected individual applicants while allowing the structural analysis to be done. She said that she had been thinking about this for 2 years without having found the right form for it, and that Priya was now the second person in the room and had the advantages of a different perspective and a different relationship to the problem, and that if Priya was interested in working on it, she was interested in working on it together. Priya said she was interested. They spent the rest of that afternoon at the table in the Foundation's administrative office, going through 6 years of pattern data with 2 sets of eyes. And by the end of the afternoon, they had the beginning of a framework that was not the framework, but was the beginning of one. The desk at home was a constant. Clara had come to understand this, not as sentiment, but as fact. The way a well-made thing provides a kind of constancy that is simply part of its character. She sat at it in the mornings with the same quality of attention she had been developing since the night she had pressed her fingers along the interior wall and felt the panel give, an attention that was not dramatic or specially gathered, but simply present, the natural posture of someone who has decided that the ordinary moments of an ordinary morning are worth attending to as fully as the significant ones. She had written this in her notebook and had then crossed it out and rewritten it more precisely, that the ordinary moments were significant, and that the designation of ordinary was a failure of attention rather than an accurate description of the moments themselves. Her aunt had known this. It was the operational principle underlying everything she had built, the understanding that the significant things were present in the daily life if the daily life was attended to with sufficient care. The morning light on the desk's surface, the quality of the wood under careful hands, the letters in the compartment, and the mechanism of the hinge, and the photograph, paper-clipped to a page from a woman named Rosalind, who had met Eleanor once at a conference and had written down something Eleanor said, and had kept it for 30 years. These were not supplementary to the significant things. They were the significant things, present at the scale of the ordinary, waiting for the quality of attention that made them legible. She thought about this often in the years that followed, as the program continued, and the framework she and Priya had begun developed into something more complete, and as Diane became a presence in her life in the gradual, unforced way of relationships that have been given enough time and enough honesty to find their own form. She thought about it when she received letters in the compartment, and when she sat with the notebook, and when she looked at the photograph of 4 women on a summer afternoon who were alive in that moment, with the particular aliveness of people who do not yet know what is coming, but are attending to the present with everything they have. She thought about the woman beside her aunt in the photograph, the one who was Margaret, the witness, the person who had been asked to remember and had remembered for 40 years, and about what it meant to be that kind of presence in someone's life and in the record of what they had done. She thought that she was becoming, in her own way, that kind of presence. Not in the same form, not for the same person, but in the same orientation, for attending to things that were worth attending to and holding them carefully, and trusting that the holding mattered even when the significance of what was being held was not immediately legible to anyone, perhaps including herself. Her aunt had done this for 30 years from a modest house with a polished desk and a notebook and a lawyer and a single trusted friend and a patience that could only be called extraordinary by people who did not understand that patience was not waiting, but rather a form of active engagement with time, a decision to work at the pace the work required rather than the pace that comfort or urgency demanded. The morning light was the same as it had always been, arriving through the east window at the same angle it had arrived the day before and the day before that, not falling across the desk's surface with the same quality her aunt had described in the letter, and that Clara had now observed across 5 years of mornings, without finding it diminished by familiarity. She opened the writing surface. She looked at the interior, at the cubbyholes and the shallow drawers, and the right interior panel that concealed the compartment where the letters now lived. She pressed her fingers to the panel and felt the gyve of the hinge, the resistance, and then the release. She left it open for a moment, the empty visible space behind it, the mechanism doing what it had been built to do. Then she drew the panel closed and opened her notebook and began to write, at the pace the writing required, about the things she was understanding and the things she wasn't yet understanding, and the difference between those two categories, which was smaller than it appeared from the outside and larger than it felt from the inside, and which had been, as far as she could tell, the operating condition of everything her aunt had built. Not certainty, not ignorance. The patient, attentive middle ground, where the work of understanding was always unfinished, and always, when attended to faithfully, advancing. The morning continued. The light moved. The work went on. If this story stayed with you all the way to the end, then you already understand why we tell stories like this one. Press subscribe, hit the bell, and share this with someone who needs it. The next story is waiting for you, and we promise it will be worth it.